This documentary examines two of Russia's most infamous detention facilities, Vologda Pyatak and Butyrka Prison, through publicly reported facts, court records, and credible investigative reporting. One is a remote life sentence colony built to isolate men condemned by the state, the other is a centuries-old urban jail that has held revolutionaries, serial killers, and political prisoners. Together, they reveal how punishment, secrecy, and power operate inside Russia's penal system. In Russia, there is a prison where men sentenced to die are not executed. They are locked away instead, alone, silent, and watched, until death arrives on its own schedule. According to court records, some have not touched another human being in decades. A former inmate once said, "Time doesn't pass here. It circles you." Officials called it necessary for public safety. Investigators called it extreme isolation. And the state insisted it worked. Tonight, we enter two of Russia's most feared prisons, and the system that created them. If you want deeply researched true crime documentaries that go where cameras rarely go, like this video and subscribe now. The road to Vologda Pyatak does not feel like a road at all. It narrows, it bends, and then it seems to disappear into forest and water. The prison sits on an island near Lake Beloy in Russia's Vologda region, surrounded by marshland and wind-scoured trees. In winter, ice locks the water in place. In summer, fog does the same job. According to Russia's Federal Penitentiary Service, this isolation was intentional. Escape, they believed, should be impossible. Contact should be minimal. Sound itself should struggle to travel. The facility's official designation is Penal Colony No. 5. Its nickname, Vologda Pyatak, comes from a small coin, implying worthlessness, or perhaps the idea that a human life could be reduced to something so small it fits in a pocket. The prison occupies what was once a monastery, founded centuries earlier by monks who sought silence and discipline. The irony has never gone unnoticed by journalists who later walked its corridors. The stone walls that once enforced spiritual reflection now enforce something far more absolute. Vologda Pyatak is where Russia sends men sentenced to life imprisonment. According to publicly available sentencing data and reporting by Russian and international media, most inmates here were convicted of aggravated murder, serial killings, terrorism-related offenses, or crimes involving multiple victims. Many arrived during the 1990s, when Russia replaced the death penalty with life sentences following its commitments to the Council of Europe. Execution was suspended. Isolation was not. Cells here are small, typically holding 1 or 2 men. Metal doors are thick. Windows are narrow and reinforced. Lights remain on at all hours, according to human rights monitors, to allow constant surveillance. Inmates are moved in handcuffs. Conversations are limited. Physical contact is tightly regulated. These conditions, prison officials argue, are necessary to manage individuals deemed permanently dangerous. According to reports by advocacy organizations and interviews published in investigative outlets, prisoners at Vologda Pyatak spend most of their lives inside their cells. Exercise, when permitted, occurs in enclosed yards barely larger than the cells themselves. The sky is visible, but distant, framed by concrete and wire. This is not incidental design. It is psychological architecture. Former prison staff, speaking anonymously to journalists, have described a system built on routine and control. Every action is logged. Every movement is watched. Silence is enforced not only through rules, but through monotony. Days are structured to blur together. Meals arrive at the same times. Lights switch on and off according to schedule. Letters, if allowed, are read. Books are counted. The message is constant: you are contained. Human rights observers have raised concerns over these conditions for years. Reports submitted to European monitoring bodies have described long-term solitary confinement and its psychological effects. Russian authorities have repeatedly responded that inmates at Vologda Pyatak are not held in solitary confinement by definition, since some share cells. But critics argue that functional isolation, limited interaction, sensory deprivation, and permanent surveillance achieves the same result. Several prisoners have challenged their conditions in court. According to case summaries cited in news reports, lawsuits have alleged violations of human dignity and mental health standards. Outcomes have varied. Some cases were dismissed. Others resulted in minor adjustments. The system itself remained. What makes Vologda Pyatak feared is not violence. There are few recorded incidents of inmate-on-inmate assaults, precisely because contact is so restricted. The fear comes from endurance. From the idea that a human being can be placed in a controlled environment and left there indefinitely, with the expectation that time itself will do the rest. But Vologda Pyatak is only one side of Russia's penal mythology. To understand how men end up here, and why the public often supports such places, you have to go back in time, and back into the city, to Butyrka Prison. Buturka rises from Moscow like a scar. Its outer walls are yellowed, heavy, unmistakable. Built in the 18th century, it has functioned continuously as a place of detention through the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the modern Russian state. According to historical records and museum archives, it once held rebels against the Tsar. Later, it processed enemies of the revolution. During Stalin's purges, it was a transit point to labor camps. In more recent decades, it became a pre-trial detention center, where suspects wait, sometimes for years, before their fate is decided. Unlike Vologda, life inside Russia's most feared prisons is not defined by chaos. It is defined by control. At Vologda Pyatak, control begins the moment a man crosses the threshold for the final time. According to prison regulations cited in court filings and investigative reports, new arrivals are stripped, searched, documented, and issued identical clothing. Personal belongings are minimal. Everything else, identity, status, past, is reduced to a file number and a sentence that has no end date. For many of the men sent here, this is their third or fourth prison. They have already passed through police holding cells, pre-trial detention centers like Buturka, and intermediate colonies. By the time they arrive, resistance has usually been worn down. What remains is calculation, how to survive indefinitely inside a system that does not expect rehabilitation. Daily life is rigid. Wake-up calls are fixed. Meals arrive through slots in metal doors. According to publicly available prison rules, inmates must stand when guards look through the inspection window. Silence is mandatory unless permission to speak is granted. Infractions, failure to comply, perceived disrespect, minor rule violations, can result in disciplinary isolation, further limiting already scarce human contact. Former inmates, quoted in long-form interviews published by Russian journalists, describe the psychological strain as cumulative rather than immediate. The first months are disorienting. The first years are numbing. After that, time becomes abstract. One man described counting years not by calendars, but by changes in regulations. Another said he measured time by the turnover of guards, noting subtle shifts in tone and discipline. Officially, inmates at Vologda Pyatak are entitled to limited recreation, correspondence, and reading materials. In practice, according to human rights observers, access depends heavily on behavior assessments and administrative discretion. A favorable report might mean an extra book or a longer letter. A negative one could mean weeks of heightened isolation. Some prisoners adapt by embracing routine. They clean obsessively. They memorize regulations. They file petitions and appeals, even when outcomes are unlikely. According to legal analysts, the act of filing itself becomes a form of agency, a way to assert existence within a bureaucratic system. Others retreat inward. Psychologists who have studied long-term incarceration, citing international research, warn that prolonged isolation can lead to depression, anxiety, cognitive decline, and emotional blunting. Russian authorities have disputed the severity of these effects, emphasizing that inmates are monitored and provided with medical care. Independent verification of mental health services inside life sentence colonies remains limited, and reports are often contradictory. Violence inside Vologda Pyatak is rare, not because of harmony, but because opportunity is minimal. Cells are sealed. Movement is choreographed. When prisoners leave their cells, they do so alone, under escort, along empty corridors. Contact with other inmates is usually restricted to shouted exchanges through walls or brief glimpses during transfers. This isolation changes the social hierarchy common in other prisons. There are no gangs in the traditional sense. No informal economies flourish. Authority is centralized and absolute. Guards do not negotiate. They enforce. Many guards are drawn from nearby regions, according to employment records and local reporting. The work is steady but demanding. Shifts are long. Interaction with inmates is constant but constrained by protocol. Several former staff members, speaking anonymously in investigative articles, have described emotional detachment as a survival mechanism. You can't think about their crimes every day, one said. And you can't think about their future. You focus on procedure. That detachment is harder to maintain at Buturka. Buturka is loud. It smells of metal, disinfectant, and overcrowding. According to multiple inspections cited in news reports, its problems have historically included insufficient space, aging infrastructure, and strained medical services. Unlike Vologda Pyatak, Buturka is temporary, at least in theory. But for detainees awaiting trial, temporary can stretch into years. Here, uncertainty dominates. Inmates do not know when their case will move forward, whether evidence will be admitted, or how long they will wait for a verdict. Lawyers come and go. Investigators ask questions and then disappear. Rumors spread faster than official updates. Publicly reported cases show that pretrial detention in Russia can be extended repeatedly with court approval. Judges often cite the risk of flight or interference with the investigation. Defense attorneys argue that extensions are granted too easily. The result is a population suspended between accusation and conviction. Cells in Buturka have historically housed a mix of people, first-time offenders, repeat criminals, businessmen accused of fraud, activists charged with extremism-related offenses. This mixture creates tension. According to former detainees, hierarchies form quickly, influenced by crime type, perceived toughness, and access to resources like money for commissary purchases. Unlike Vologda Pyatak, where silence is enforced, Buturka is a place of constant negotiation. Space is negotiated. Sleep is negotiated. Even standing room can become contested. Fights break out, according to incident reports referenced in media coverage, but they are not constant. More often, pressure expresses itself through psychological dominance and social maneuvering. Guards here play a different role. They are enforcers, but also mediators. They manage conflicts, move inmates between cells, and sometimes rely on informal leaders to maintain order. This dynamic has been documented in prison studies across multiple countries, and Russia is no exception. For some detainees, Buturka becomes the most traumatic part of their incarceration. One former prisoner, interviewed after his release, said the uncertainty ate at you more than the walls. He described nights spent listening to others cry quietly, trying not to draw attention. Another spoke of learning to sleep sitting up, wedged between bunk frames, because there was no room to lie down. Medical care in Buturka has been a recurring subject of scrutiny. According to reports by oversight commissions and journalists, access to doctors has improved in recent years but remains inconsistent. High-profile cases, where detainees died or suffered severe illness in custody, have sparked public debate and official investigations. Outcomes vary. Some result in disciplinary action. Others fade from attention. The contrast between Buturka and Vologda Pyatak is stark, but they are linked by design. Buturka is where pressure is applied to extract compliance, confessions, plea deals, cooperation. Vologda Pyatak is where compliance no longer matters, because the sentence is final. Not every man who passes through Buturka ends up on a remote island. Many receive shorter sentences or are acquitted. But for those convicted of the most serious crimes, the transfer to a life sentence colony marks a psychological shift. According to sociologists who have studied Russian penal culture, this shift is reinforced by language. Life sentence prisoners are often referred to in administrative documents as a separate category, governed by special rules. The label itself becomes part of their identity. Some inmates attempt to maintain a sense of self through writing. Letters, diaries, and legal complaints become outlets. A few have published memoirs or essays after release from earlier sentences, though life sentence prisoners rarely see publication. In rare cases, excerpts of correspondence have appeared in investigative pieces, offering glimpses into inner lives shaped by extreme confinement. Religion also plays a role for some. Both Butyrka and Vologda Pyatak have chapels, according to official records. Access to clergy is regulated but permitted. For certain inmates, faith provides structure. Prisons like Vologda Pyatak and Butyrka did not emerge by accident. They are the product of law, politics, and fear, layered over decades, reinforced by public opinion, and administered by a bureaucracy designed to endure scrutiny without fundamentally changing. At the center of that bureaucracy is the Federal Penitentiary Service of Russia, commonly known by its Russian acronym, FSN. According to government records, FSN oversees hundreds of detention facilities across the country, ranging from short-term holding centers to remote high-security colonies. Its mandate is broad: enforce sentences, maintain order, and prevent escape. Its authority is extensive, and its operations are largely closed to the public. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia faced a crisis of legitimacy in its justice system. Crime rates surged in the 1990s, fueled by economic instability, weakened institutions, and the rise of organized criminal networks. Public trust in the state eroded, and with it came a demand for harsher punishment. Politicians responded with tough-on-crime rhetoric, expanded sentencing laws, and the construction or repurposing of high-security facilities. The abolition of the death penalty, formalized through Russia's international commitments and constitutional rulings, created a new problem for lawmakers. What should be done with offenders previously sentenced to die? The answer was life imprisonment under special conditions. According to legislative records and legal commentary, these conditions were intentionally strict. Lawmakers argued that society needed protection from individuals deemed beyond rehabilitation. Vologda Pyatak became a symbol of that philosophy. Its design reflected a belief that control, isolation, and permanence were not only acceptable, but necessary. Court rulings upholding life sentences often cited the severity of crimes and the absence of alternatives. In this framework, the prison itself was not the punishment, the sentence was. The facility merely enforced it. Buturka, by contrast, represents the system's front end, where law enforcement, prosecutors, and courts intersect. Pretrial detention plays a central role in Russian criminal procedure. According to procedural codes and court statistics reported in the media, suspects can be held while investigations continue, often for extended periods. Judges routinely approve extensions, citing standardized risks. Critics argue that this practice shifts the balance of power heavily toward the prosecution. Defense attorneys interviewed by journalists have described pretrial detention as a pressure mechanism, one that encourages confessions or plea agreements. Officials deny systemic abuse, pointing to legal safeguards and appellate review. The truth, as reflected in case studies, appears uneven. High-profile cases occasionally break through the opacity. When a detainee dies in custody, or when footage leaks from inside a cell, public attention spikes. Investigations are announced. Statements are issued. In some cases, reforms follow: new regulations, pilot programs, oversight commissions. In others, the system absorbs the criticism and continues. International scrutiny has also shaped the system, though not always in the way reformers hoped. Reports from European monitoring bodies and human rights organizations have documented concerns about overcrowding, medical care, and long-term isolation. Russian officials have often responded defensively, framing criticism as political interference. Select reforms are implemented, but core practices remain intact. Within FSIN, career advancement depends on compliance with regulations and maintenance of order. According to former officials interviewed in investigative reports, innovation is risky. Deviating from established procedures can invite scrutiny or disciplinary action. As a result, institutional inertia dominates. What worked yesterday is repeated tomorrow. Public opinion reinforces this inertia. Surveys cited in Russian media consistently show strong support for severe punishment for violent crimes. Politicians echo these sentiments, particularly after high-profile offenses. In this environment, advocating for leniency or systemic reform carries political risk. Prisons like Vologda Pyatak become proof points, evidence that the state is firm, decisive, and protective. Yet the system is not monolithic. Inside courtrooms, judges sometimes push back against prosecutors, reducing charges or rejecting detention requests. Some prison administrators experiment quietly with improved conditions or expanded educational programs, within the limits of regulation. These efforts are rarely publicized, and their impact is difficult to measure. Transfers between facilities reveal another layer of the system's logic. According to procedural descriptions in court filings, prisoners are classified based on offense, sentence length, behavior, and perceived risk. These classifications determine not only where a person is held, but how they are treated, what they can read, how often they can communicate, whether they can work. Life sentence prisoners occupy the lowest rung in this hierarchy. Their prospects for release are minimal. While Russian law technically allows for parole after a long period, often cited as 25 years, successful applications are exceedingly rare, according to legal analyses. This reality shapes behavior on both sides of the bars. Inmates learn that compliance may bring small comforts, but not freedom. Staff learn that long-term management, not rehabilitation, is the goal. Buturka's role in this system is more fluid. Because its population is constantly changing, it reflects shifts in law enforcement priorities. Waves of detainees arrive following crackdowns on specific crimes: fraud, extremism-related offenses, organized crime. Each wave brings new challenges, new tensions, and new narratives about threat and control. Media coverage plays a dual role. Investigative journalists expose abuses and failures, but sensational reporting can also reinforce fear. Stories emphasizing brutality and danger support calls for harsher measures. Nuanced analysis struggles to compete with shock. Inside FSIN, statistics matter. Incidents are logged. Escapes are counted. Complaints are tracked. According to internal reports cited in oversight reviews, success is measured by stability. A quiet prison is a good prison. From this perspective, facilities like Vologda Pyatak are exemplary. There are few disturbances. Few headlines. The system appears to work. What these metrics do not capture is erosion. The slow erosion of mental health. The erosion of identity. The erosion of accountability that comes with secrecy. These costs are difficult to quantify and easy to dismiss. The picture sharpens: Russia's most feared prisons are not anomalies. They are logical outcomes of a system shaped by history, fear, and political calculation. To dismantle or fundamentally reform them would require confronting not only laws and institutions, but public beliefs about punishment and safety. We confront the consequences: what happens after decades behind walls, what the world sees when fragments of these prisons emerge, and what the future may hold for a system built to last longer than the men inside it. For most men inside Vologda Pyatak, the future is not something that arrives. It is something that recedes. Years pass without milestones. There are no release dates to circle, no countdowns etched into walls. According to sentencing data and legal analyses, life imprisonment in Russia is legally defined as permanent removal from society, with parole existing more as a theoretical safeguard than a practical outcome. When officials speak of hope, they speak in abstractions. When inmates speak of it at all, they speak cautiously. The few who attempt parole after decades of incarceration face a process shaped less by transformation than by risk avoidance. Court decisions cited in legal reporting show that parole boards focus heavily on the original crime, not the passage of time. Expressions of remorse are weighed, but rarely decisive. Any disciplinary record, no matter how old, can outweigh years of compliance. In this framework, release becomes an exception so rare it reinforces the rule. For those men, legacy is not about freedom. It is about endurance. Some inmates leave traces through paperwork, appeals, petitions, complaints filed with domestic courts and international bodies. These documents, quoted in investigative articles, form a parallel archive of incarceration. They describe conditions in precise, legal language, hours of isolation, access to medical care, temperature, light. They are attempts to translate lived experience into something the outside world might recognize. Occasionally, those attempts break through. Over the years, fragments of Vologda Pyatak and Butyrka have surfaced in the public sphere, through leaked photographs, inspection reports, or rare interviews. Each time, the reaction follows a familiar pattern. Outrage from activists. Defensiveness from officials. Indifference or approval from segments of the public who see harsh punishment as justified. When journalists ask officials about life sentence colonies, responses emphasize safety. According to official statements, these prisons prevent recidivism by design. The men held there will never harm again. From a purely statistical standpoint, that claim is difficult to dispute. From a moral standpoint, it remains contested. Butyrka's legacy is different, but no less heavy. As Moscow modernizes, Butyrka stands as a reminder of continuity rather than change. Its walls have witnessed Tsars, commissars, and presidents. They have held revolutionaries, criminals, and political dissidents. According to historical records and museum exhibits, its role has shifted with ideology, but its function has not. It remains a place where the state holds people before judgment, often for long stretches of time. In recent years, officials have announced plans to reduce reliance on aging detention centers like Buturka, proposing new facilities on the outskirts of cities. Some detainees have been relocated. Conditions in certain areas have improved. Yet Buturka continues to operate, its presence normalized by familiarity. Reform arrives slowly, filtered through budget constraints and political will. The human cost of this system is difficult to measure, but its effects ripple outward. Families of inmates live in a kind of suspended state. According to interviews published in regional newspapers, relatives of life sentence prisoners often travel long distances for brief, highly regulated visits, if visits are permitted at all. Communication is limited. Relationships strain and fracture under time and distance. Children grow up knowing a parent only through letters. Guards, too, carry the weight of these institutions. Studies on correctional work, including research cited in Russian academic journals, suggest high levels of stress and burnout among prison staff. The emotional detachment required to function inside facilities like Vologda Pyatak can spill into personal lives. Turnover is steady. Silence becomes a habit. Internationally, Russia's prison system remains a point of tension. Human rights rulings and monitoring reports continue to highlight concerns about isolation, medical care, and due process. Russian authorities continue to argue that their approach reflects national circumstances and security needs. This standoff has hardened over time, with fewer channels for compromise. Yet even within this rigidity, cracks appear. In rare cases, sentences are revisited. New evidence emerges. Convictions are overturned. According to court records cited in investigative journalism, a small number of men have been exonerated after years in custody. For those individuals, the aftermath is complex. Freedom arrives late and incomplete, shadowed by trauma and loss. Their stories raise uncomfortable questions about certainty in a system built on permanence. Public perception is slowly shifting, though unevenly. Younger generations, exposed to international standards and digital reporting, express more skepticism about extreme punishment in opinion polls cited by analysts. Others remain firmly supportive of harsh measures, particularly in response to violent crime. The debate is ongoing, unresolved, and deeply tied to broader questions about authority and trust. Vologda Pyatak's legacy, then, is not just a prison on an island. It is a statement about how far a state is willing to go to neutralize perceived threats. Buturka's legacy is not just age and notoriety. It is a reminder of how easily temporary detention can become prolonged limbo. Together, they form a continuum, from accusation to finality, that defines Russia's approach to its most feared offenders. As this documentary closes, there is no simple conclusion. These prisons have succeeded in one sense: they have isolated danger. But they have also isolated accountability, burying complex moral questions beneath layers of procedure and stone. The men inside will age. Some will die. A few may leave. The institutions will remain, adapting slightly, resisting fundamentally. Their true legacy will not be measured only in crime statistics or security reports, but in how future generations judge the balance struck between safety and humanity. Because long after the cells are emptied and the walls crumble, the question will persist: what does a society become when it builds places designed to outlast the people inside them?